Okay, so now what we want to do is try to analyze the domestic market when there are exports. Okay, we try to find out, well, what is the total surplus and what is it in comparison to when we don't have trade? Okay, so remember, when we have no trade, okay, this is what the result is from the previous video. Okay, what we have is our domestic demand, our domestic supply, and then where they cross is our equilibrium price, which we then use in concert with the demand and supply to find the consumer producer surplus, and then their summation being the total. Okay, so the total surplus, is the green area plus the red. Okay, so what happens when we have exports? Okay, so the idea is in order for a country to export a good, there has to be a surplus, okay, domestically. So what would we say is the relationship between the quantity domestically supplied and domestically demanded? Okay, so it's something like this. Okay, there must be a surplus, so the domestic supply is what has to be greater than the domestic demand. Okay, in order for this to be, though, what can we say about the world price in relation to the domestic equilibrium? Well, in order to have more supply than demand domestically, it must be that this world price is above that domestic equilibrium. Okay. All right, so that tells us then what the price is going to be in terms of this market. Then we can't be too specific about what it is. We don't know specifically what number, but we do know it is above the domestic equilibrium. So again, as before, we draw the domestic supply and the domestic demand. Okay, we have our domestic equilibrium price. Okay, followed by our world price. Okay, so the question is, what is the producer surplus and what is the consumer surplus? So remember, the consumer surplus is supposed to be what is below the demand curve, but above the price. Now remember, since this is trade, the price this market is subject to is the world price. Okay, so in terms of the consumer surplus then, it's below this domestic demand, but above this world price. Okay. All right, so that's our consumer surplus, and then what's our producer surplus? Okay, producer surplus, again, below the price and above the supply. Okay, and so that's what the producer surplus is. So we have our consumer surplus here. And we have our producer surplus here. Okay, so what is the difference? If we look at the two graphs of trade versus no trade, okay, we notice in terms of total surplus, which one is greater? Okay, we see the one with trade is actually greater. And where can we see that? In particular about how much, it's basically this area here. Okay, so in terms of this, we would say that total surplus is basically this net benefit to society for a particular market is higher when we have trade. Okay. All right, so we see that at least in terms of when we have exports. But the question is, what about for imports? And so the next lecture I'm going to do is try to show you for that.